I was a practicing lawyer for 15 years as an adversary. And at one point, I realized I wanted to stop. I thought it would be impossible because it's very hard to get into the practice of mediation or conflict resolution, which is what I wanted to do. But all of a sudden, all these doors opened up, and I found myself with this practice, a thriving practice, really without having to do anything. Of course, I was sort of taking credit for this and feeling, oh, I'm so blessed, I'm so special kind of thing. And I was doing some good work with people. The first moment when I got the hint that I was actually in for a period of initiation rather than something more glamorous came during a very large mediation I was doing, which was a very large commercial mediation with people from all over the country, a lot of money involved. The offer came in from the defendant, the plaintiff to the defendant, and one of the defendants blew up. He started to attack me, the process. He was ready to walk out. This offer was outrageous. It was insulting. The whole demeanor was very intense, strong, insults, and ready to move. While he was talking, I stayed in contact with him in my professional role, but I went inside and I basically inwardly sort of disappeared. And I asked myself, what is actually happening? And the answer was, it's actually all about him. It's not about the offer, it's about him. How does he think he's being seen? How does he think other people are seeing him? The whole thing was actually about him. So I came kind of back into contact, which I hadn't really left, but came back in. And I started trying to move him to a more objective place. Very respectful, going through the details, looking at objectively what is actually being offered to you. And within, I would say, 15 or 20 minutes, there was no problem, and we moved on. But for me, a really important thing had happened, which is I had seen that the self, the issues regarding the self, were the front and center in mediation. And I took it at that point as a task to start watching all of the ways the conflicts resolved from the point of view of self and identity. Some time passed, and I was making my observations and helping people as best I could. And while some cases were going well and so on, something started to happen in me. I started to feel disappointed. And it was difficult for me. And what was happening is that I was seeing the worst in people. I was seeing just how far people would actually go in the service of what they thought of as the self. I was seeing greed. I was seeing envy. I was seeing friends stick the knife to each other. I was seeing the family where the child is being destroyed. I was seeing the professional who does a terrible thing to the client and refuses to take responsibility. I was also seeing people who were very entrapped in being a victim, blowing up what had happened on both sides, in other words. But I was being exposed day after day, really, to the worst in human nature. Just as this started to happen, another thing happened, which is that in my own spiritual life, I found myself in a crisis, an impasse, with some people that I really respected and admired. And it was like an impossible conflict, and I had to admit to myself it was not going to resolve. So at this point now, I'm not anymore thinking of myself as the blessed peacemaker for all these other people. I'm now feeling very disappointed on my own. And really, I was devastated, to be very honest. This was one of the worst periods of my life. While this was happening, I had a thought of a prayer which I had heard from Thich Nhat Hanh. And it's a very beautiful prayer. And it said, "Bless me into usefulness." And I started to think, what is the use of this experience I'm having? There must be some use to it. And I eventually came to the idea that the things I had seen about the way self and identity worked in conflict and conflict resolution were significant beyond me, and that it was like my job, in a sense, to share them. So that's what I'm doing here and trying to do with my publications, and what we'll do today a little bit. Now, what I've learned from studying the work of Peter Levine and the trauma people is that before you go into the dark side, which is where we're going, you always want to resource yourself and bring in some light. So for that reason, I've brought this beautiful video from some friends who wanted to be here but couldn't, from Australia. And it is medicinemusic.com.au. And you'll see it's from the Beatitudes, and they're singing in Aramaic mostly. So let's have, also, please feel free to move during this or whatever. This is meant to give us a little elevation before we kind of dive in. So hopefully it can work now. Beautiful. What did I see? What I saw is that the spiritual teachers like Gurdjieff and all of the spiritual teachers were right, that the human sense of self and identity was completely volatile, changeable, and unreliable in many ways. But I also saw that in conflict resolution and in conflict, it actually tended to shift in a definable, predictable manner. And I called that the IDR cycle. The other thing I saw was that disappointment is the doorway through which people in conflict often have to move in order to move past the ego, the limited sense of the self, and to the ability to work with others and compromise or come to a conclusion with others. The way I first saw this was you would just keep seeing over and over that people would come in, and in the first stage, they would be kind of like, I'm so tough, I am going to do this. And they would be overconfident, they would be inflated. And it was always like there was in the background this sense of, I'm such a winner, I'm going to do this. It's not that one shouldn't be confident, I want to make this clear. But these people generally, and I myself, I must say, when I was having conflicts, I saw this in myself also, as I saw all of these other things they're just overconfident. In other words, if the case, in law we have kind of objective standards to some extent, if the case was worth, $10 million, they thought it was worth 30, and then they asked for 70 because you have to posture. So I kept seeing this over and over, and energetically, the experience of it was kind of like, remember George Bush when he did that mission accomplished speech? It was like, the war is over, and I have won it. The only problem being the war is not over. Other people are in this situation, and actually the war has just begun. This is the feeling of it. Now, when I sat down to write my articles, I actually discovered that this phenomena, which I thought no one would believe me, was very well established. And in fact, there were articles saying that it had been one of the most robust findings in the social science literature in decades. So people knew about this. Since that time, I've also been trying to understand why it happens. And just to go very quickly, I think that there's a neuroscience piece of it, which is that the human being always monitors the environment for danger. It's called neuroception in the language of Stephen Porges. It's an involuntary and automatic process that we're going through. And when there is a sense of danger, the amygdala and other areas of the brain fire, which start to respond and mobilize to danger. In 2007, there was a very interesting article by Sharot. I think it was in Nature magazine or journal. And it said that they were examining the brains of people when they were in what they called the optimism bias, overconfidence. And they found, interestingly, that the amygdala was firing, and so was the anterior cingulate cortex. So how I understand this, and this is a large subject which we'll have to go through quickly, is that overconfidence is the psychological correlate of the firing of the sympathetic nervous system and the mobilization of the readiness to fight. That's why, in a sense, for many people, it actually has to happen. It's not an accident. The organism is preparing itself for fight. Now, the thing that I saw about this is the logical consequences, the emotional consequences, which were that if you come in and you're up, right? What goes up must go down. So the I in my IDR cycle concept is the inflation, that I'm a winner. Next is deflation. And the person starts to get disappointed. They start to experience that things are not going to be just the way they thought. Take that first example I gave of the client who got so insulted. Imagine that happening to you in a conflict, over and over as the negotiation goes on. You're finding out that the expectations your ego has set for the conduct of another person are not being met. The last part, I'm just going to skip because we don't have much time here, is realistic resolution. That is, if I could help the person move to a place past the ego involvement, past the ego disappointment, hopefully the goal was help them to move to a place of realism, truth, really, about what the situation was. The part I want to talk about, just to make a little bit of a snapshot on it, is the place of impasse. That impasse is the place where both sides know that unless they give up the identification that their ego has developed with who they are, unless they get past the impasse, nothing is going to settle. And at that point, there is a real choice to move past the ego. At that point, sometimes, for some people, there's actually like a quasi-mystical experience. The person actually goes past who they are, especially if, possible, I can help them with that. I'll just give one example. There was a woman who was a plaintiff in an employment discrimination case. There were racial slurs directed at her. It was a painful case for her. But she had a difficult case. She had blown the statute of limitations. Overconfident, she thought she would be able to settle it for more than necessary or more than possible. And she and I are sitting in this conference room, in this long kind of legal conference room, and I'm looking at her and I'm really feeling who she is much more than this. And I wasn't making this up, I wasn't manipulating her, I felt that at that moment. And I said to her, you're such an intelligent person, it seems. I see you as more like a businesswoman. Make a business decision. You see what happened? After that, she melted because her identity had been seen, her real identity, who she really was, not the ego level. Now, real quick, I'd like to go to my story and end on a happy note. I told the story partly so you could see that this cycle of overconfidence and deflation and realistic resolution happens to us also. That was my story also. But what did happen was that through the work I had to do in this area of conflict resolution, sorting out what was happening in my spiritual community, it was like heavy lifting for me for a number of years. I did start to experience, not all the time, I'm not claiming to be some like enlightened master or something, I experienced more peace. And what I learned about peace is that peace is never a question. Peace never happens on the ego level. It never happens because of another person. It can't. Other people and me, myself, we're not reliable enough to be peaceful with. Right? Isn't that true? Peace happens when there is this sense of the self-surrendering, but it's not surrendering to another. It's surrendering to the truth, like she was surrendering to the truth of the situation, not to the defendants. When we surrender to being, to a sense of presence, it's a very palpable feeling. It feels like, yes, the war is over. I finally know something more real to rely on, something that can really bring me peace, something that can really bring me the kind of things that I was hoping to bring people, you see, on a professional level for all those years. So that's really what I have to say. Thank you.
I love thy ishlema, dafnai, dahanit karun.